Hello, this is Tyson coming at you with another TCon video. This time we're learning about the loanable funds market and how we use it to show the crowding out effect. And then we can think about the differences and similarities between the loanable funds and the money markets, and a little bit more about how real and nominal interest rates connect via the Fisher equation. So that's our purpose. And in terms of where this situates in your knowledge for class, most of the information in here will go on the back of template 8, where you'll have money market on the front and loanable funds on the back. But it also connects to template 6 that you made about fiscal and monetary policy. So let's go ahead and move forward analyzing the loanable funds market. Okay, so what's the big idea of loanable funds market? Well, the big notion is that we're bringing together long-term lenders and borrowers. And in this market, the lenders are going to be the suppliers of funds, and the borrowers will be the demanders of funds. It's different than the money market because of the time horizon we're dealing with, and more about that a little bit later. The loanable funds market is the place you would look to figure out what the real interest rate in an economy is and what are the quantity of funds that are borrowed for long-term purposes or lent for long-term purposes might be. Okay, so here we move down a little bit and we can think about the graph itself and how we make that work. So one of the first things when you draw a graph in econ is you want to think about what the axes are, and here's the price of money. But when we're doing lending for a long-term period, we're really quite concerned about the interest we could earn after we subtract off the effects of inflation. If you're lending money in the money market just for a day or something, it's fine to ignore inflation. But here we're thinking about lending for 30 years for a mortgage for a house, or for 5 years for somebody to buy a car, or for however long it takes to pay back a student loan, which might be 1 or 2 lifetimes. At any rate, if you didn't think about the effects of inflation and you were talking in decades, you would really end up regretting that choice. So that's a bit about the vertical axis. In much the same way that in the market for cars, we would have quantity of cars on the horizontal axis. In the market for t-shirts, we have quantity of t-shirts. Here in the loanable funds market, we're going to have quantity of loanable funds. And if you want to abbreviate, it's fine to do so, but I would recommend doing Q sub LF rather than Q dollar sign. When we learned money market, I said Q money or Q sub M, not Q dollar sign. There's 3 graphs that if you do Q dollar sign, you're sort of confusing what's on the horizontal axis in all of them. So whatever the title of the graph is, quantity of that is usually a pretty good benchmark for how you label that horizontal axis in econ. And in the loanable funds market, we're going to have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds curve. And let's first think about the demand curve and what it's composed of. Now, if we scroll back up to what we thought about, we're bringing together lenders and borrowers, and the borrowers are the demanders of funds. So we need to think about who wants to borrow money for a long chunk of time. And I gave a few hints a minute ago. Basically, we divide that into 3 components. And the first type of institution that wants to borrow money for long periods of time would be households if they're going to do interest-sensitive consumption. So if I want to borrow money to buy a car, borrow money to send my kids to college, maybe even for some things that don't quite count toward GDP, if I want to borrow money to buy a house, even if it's not a new house, I still have to borrow funds to do that. So that's households, interest-sensitive consumption. The second one would be business firms when they want to do investment. They borrow to build that new factory or buy that new pizza oven, and then they make a payment every month, and there you can make that payment because they sold more pizzas. So those are 2 components of the demand for loanable funds, and sometimes we're going to add in a third one, which will be government if it needs to borrow due to a budget deficit. So that's sort of what we're thinking about here for the demand curve. And obviously when interest rates are high, businesses don't want to do as much investment. We don't want to buy as many new cars. And so therefore, the quantity demanded is low. And when interest rates are low, it's cheap to borrow. I'm likely to buy the new car. I'm likely to send the kid to a more expensive college. I'm likely to buy new furniture for the living room or buy a bigger house because I can afford it with the same monthly payment. So that's kind of a bit about that demand for loanable funds. We're going to build in the government later. Right now, we'll just think about demand for loanable funds as having these 2 components right here. Okay? And so now let's think about a little bit about the supply of loanable funds. Where do these funds come from? And your instinct might to say, well, you'd go to the bank and borrow that money. Okay, but where did the bank get the money? And really the answer to that mostly is that money comes from savings. Some textbooks will even take this curve here, this upward sloping supply of loanable funds curve. Some textbooks might even call that curve savings supply. So demand comes from borrowers, firms and households, and supply comes from lender savers. If I put money in a savings account, well, that bank can lend it out, and they know that because I put it in savings, I'm probably not going to spend it the next day. Sometimes, if there were a government surplus, if tax revenue is bigger than government spending, then the government would be adding to supply of loanable funds. That doesn't seem like the political reality in our current time and era because we always have a budget deficit where G is bigger than T. In the real world, there are also some demand and supply of loanable funds. If foreigners wanted to borrow money in the United States, maybe it was cheaper to do than in their own country. Or conversely, if foreigners didn't want to lend in their country, if they wanted to lend in the US, maybe it was more likely they'd be paid back or something. They like the business climate or the tax climate here, then they might lend here, and then they'd be adding to supply. The foreign sector demand and supply is not really ever a thing that you're going to be probably tested over here. So I'm kind of leaving that out to simplify, but that's a real world thing that exists. So there's your loanable funds market, real interest rate, upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, quantity of loanable funds, and there's your picture of 3 components of demand and 2 components of supply. Now, why do we need to use this graph? Glad you asked. Here are 3 processes that you want to be able to show in a loanable funds market. And I've got that asterisk by this thing called the crowding out effect because that is by far and away the most common thing that the AP questions will ask you to think about the loanable funds market or draw it out if it's a free response question in order to think about how this crowding out effect works. But we can analyze the other 2 just a little bit as well. Here's a brief description of how each one works, and then I'm going to go into a lot more detail about crowding out. So the crowding out effect is a thing that occurs when government has to borrow, and when government borrows, what happens is that they would shift the demand for loanable funds to the right because they would be an additional borrower, so more demanders, more demand. Think of this as now DLF2, and then that, of course, would cause a rise in the interest rate. And there's some negative consequences associated with that we call the crowding out effect. So there's a little preview of that. What is this idea of capital flight? Capital flight, let's say the savers in a country were kind of panicky and they didn't want to lend in that country anymore. They thought it was unsafe to do so. Maybe they thought that they would never get paid back. So they move their money to somewhere else. Maybe there's a threat of political violence or an economic dislocation. And so now we have a situation where SLF1 shifts left to become SLF2. And of course, we show that this way. And then you can see here that here's lower real interest rate R1. Sorry, that's messy R. And then here's higher real interest rate R2. And so you can see that the real interest rate went up. So it gets costlier to borrow because savers move their funds out of the country. They move their financial capital out of the country because they're afraid. So you call it capital flight is the idea of that. And then, of course, if there was an increase in investment demand, that's just more businesses want to borrow more money because maybe they think economic conditions will be more favorable in the future. Well, now DLF1 shifts right to become DLF2. Here's our shift. We have a lower R1 interest rate and now a higher R2 interest rate, and that interest rate goes up, you can tell. And of course, more funds would be lent and borrowed. So we could see Q1 shifting to the right to become Q2. So that's a bit about how investment demand shifts might occur if businesses thought the economic conditions would be more favorable, or how capital flight might occur if people who were lender savers panicked. All right, we're going to move on and go into a little more depth about this crowding out effect now, because this is a process you can bet that every year on the AP macro test, they will ask at least a couple multiple choice questions to test your knowledge of this, and frequently it shows up on the free response too, where you have to draw a picture of it. So we're going to go ahead and figure out that in a bit of depth. So it's a negative side effect of expansionary fiscal policy. Let's rewind a little and explain and make sure we're clear on what expansionary fiscal policy is. Expansionary fiscal policy is increasing government purchases or cutting taxes or increasing public transfer payments like Social Security payments. And all of these would move the budget balance toward deficit. In other words, if we had a balanced budget, we would now have a deficit. If we had a surplus, we would have a smaller surplus, or we wouldn't have a surplus at all. If we had a deficit, we'd then have a bigger deficit. So these cause the government to have to borrow more, no matter what. And here we get crowding out effect. So it's obviously a process that involves cause and effect. So we'll sort of think about how that works. And here's an explanation that I wrote up in advance. Government borrowing, as a result of the deficit, shifts the demand for loanable funds to the right. The government will have to borrow the amount of the deficit, however much G was minus T, no matter what the interest rate is. So we show a parallel rightward shift of the demand for loanable funds. And now we're going to start thinking about what's the effect of the parallel rightward shift of the demand for loanable funds. First, let me sketch out a little bit of a picture on our graph here. So I'm going to get the real interest rate up here, and I'm going to get the quantity of loanable funds. Sorry, this touchscreen is acting up a little bit here, but that says Q sub LF. We can make that better. And then we have a demand for loanable funds curve here. And then we have a supply of loanable funds curve here. Remember, that's upsloping, different than the money market. And we then could also go ahead and put in here and in here, just for reference, that we would have now identified our real interest rate R1 and our quantity Q1 for reference, because later we can come back and then maybe compare those real interest rates and quantities. And what did we decide here? Well, we said that we were going to get a parallel rightward shift of the demand for loanable funds. So let's go ahead and see if I could draw that in pretty close to parallel here. Okay, so this is DLF2. And let's contrast here. DLF1 was just the private sector borrowers, and DLF2 was the private sector plus government. Okay, so the size of this line here, right there, that distance is the amount that the government had to borrow. And so I'll just label that deficit so that you can remind yourself that that's how much the government had to borrow. Okay. Well, what happened? I think we can pretty much tell what happened here, because we can see at the new higher demand curve intersecting with the supply curve, we now have higher R2. And we'll go ahead and show that that caused an increase in the interest rate. Thought I made that a solid line, but that's okay. R1 increase, now it's at R2. Okay. Well, what happened to quantity? And this is a little bit tricky here. It may seem like it's pretty obvious here. We could come down here and say, well, okay, this is obviously Q2. I'm not even going to call it Q2. I'm going to call it, why that's not working, I don't know. Hopefully it'll be solid here. I'm going to call it Q total. Goodness, why that's not happening, I don't know. Q total. That quantity over here is the quantity borrowed by privates plus the government. Remember, this much right here is borrowed by the government, no matter the interest rate. So this much here is borrowed by the government, and the rest by privates. Well, what happened to the amount of private sector borrowing, the amount that households and firms borrow to do investment and interest-sensitive consumption. And I think it's pretty clear if we look at the graph here that we can tell that that decreased. I want that little one. Goodness, why can't I grab that? Ooh, frustration. All right, we're good. So how much do the private sector borrowers end up wanting to borrow at new, higher R2? Well, we can think about it a couple of ways. One of them is to say, well, let's figure out how much everybody borrows and then subtract off the government. The rest will be the private sector. And so that would give you a quantity right around in here. And the other way would be to come and look at the higher R2. Let's look at the old demand curve that was just privates, just the households and the businesses. And that would be this intersection point right here. Well, either way, oh no, this again. Goodness. Either way, we're going to come up with the conclusion that because of where this crossing point is right here, we will find out, let me make it a different line style here, and we can go, oh, gracious. Okay, here we go. We're going to draw a downwards dashed line from there, and this will give us Q private. Okay, now what happened there? Did quantity increase or did it decrease? Yes, is the answer to that. I want to clone that guy. That distance has to definitionally be the same as this distance here. The total amount borrowed and lent, government included, increased. The amount borrowed and lent by just privates, the amount borrowed by privates for consumption and investment actually decreased. So let's summarize that and see what happened. The higher interest rate, I've got that as R2 here, made borrowing more costly for the private sector borrowers, and that meant that they don't want to borrow as much. So using fiscal policy to shift AD to the right ended up squeezing down investment and interest-sensitive consumption just ever so slightly. The amount of the decrease was this distance right here. That's the amount that businesses and households got crowded out or squeezed out. That's how much borrowing they used to want to do, but now they don't because government action pushed the interest rate up from R1 to R2. So this right here caused that change right there. Okay, that little arrow. So what? What's the importance or impact or significance of it? Well, let's look at that a little bit. There are two consequences of this. And the second one is more important and more tested, but kind of it's good to know them both. So let's think here a little bit. AD doesn't shift as far to the right as we might expect. Wait, what? AD? We're not talking about that graph. Well, what was the whole point? The whole point we started with was we did expansionary fiscal policy. And by now, hopefully you know that expansionary fiscal policy is designed to shift AD to the right. And we increased G, but yet in effect we squeezed C and I down a tiny bit, and in total AD still shifts to the right, but it doesn't go quite as far to the right as we might have thought. So this weakens the multiplier effect, and there's a bunch of reasons why 1 over MPS is an overestimate of the multiplier, because when I earn $1, the government takes some of it in taxes, I spend some of it on imports, the price level rises, so really GDP is not going to increase by, 1 over MPS times that change, but this is one more factor that weakens it. Here's the reason that they really test you over this. You got to think a little bit about what investment means. Investment is businesses buying new tools that they add to something we call the capital stock. What is that? That's the pool of available tools and machinery in the entire economy. I might call it the national tool shed sometimes in class. So we don't add as many new tools to the tool shed. So the number of tools in the tool shed grows a little bit more slowly than it otherwise would. And that means that a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, we don't have quite as many tools as otherwise we would. And that means that the long run growth rate of the economy is slowed down. So the outward shifting of our PPF that happens over time, the rightward shifting of LRAS that goes along with having a higher full employment output, those things are slowed down. And this argument was brought to the forefront in American economics during the decades right after World War II by economists known as the monetarists, or sometimes even the Chicago School. And that's Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, if you're interested in the names of some famous economists. I left out there the question of, is there a solution? And you might wonder, well, fiscal policy is the president and Congress, and they took action that would cause the interest rates to increase, and that had this negative consequence. Is there something that could be done that could fix that? Well, if you've wondered if maybe somebody else could take some action that would reduce interest rates to offset that, then your mind is moving in the right direction. And so the idea is that maybe if we did expansionary fiscal policy, we would want to also have the Fed or the central bank expand the money supply, make sure that there's more funds that banks can lend out that kind of pushes the interest rates down about as much as the president and Congress taking their fiscal policy action might have pushed them up. And if they were to do that, then we would say that they had kind of accommodated the expansionary fiscal policy and sort of made sure that there were enough funds for businesses and households to borrow as many as they otherwise would have wanted. Okay, crowding out effect, pretty important thing, frequently tested, and one of the few things in economics where they test the process in one direction, but they don't really ask you questions about how crowding back in would work if you did contractionary fiscal policy. So this is one of the very few things that you kind of just need to learn in one direction. I think I'm going to stop this video here and then do a second part where we compare where we compare the money market to the loanable funds market, think about some of the similarities and differences, and then examine the Fisher equation so we can relate the real interest rate that you see up here to the nominal interest rate that gets determined in the money market. Thanks for watching.